Welcome back, museum pros and enthusiasts. I'm Alex Freeman, the Director of Special Project at the NMC. I'll be your host and moderator for this session on location-based services. Location-based services provide content that is dynamically customized according to a user's location and is poised to be have a big impact on museums of the future. Our panelists today have worked with location-based services, or LBS for short, in their work environments, and will engage in a discussion about their involvement with this technology and its implications for the museum of the future. I'll take a moment to introduce each speaker individually and then let them talk about their background and how they use LBS in their environment. First off, we have Joe Baskerville, who's head of technology at Cogapp. Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. It's insanely hot in this room. I'm in the UK. So I am Joe Baskerville. I'm head of new technology at Cogapp. We do a lot of work with many great museums. I've got a little bunch of slides I'm going to go through here, if that's okay, Alex. Is that right? You want me to do this now?
Yeah. Go ahead and give us a background of what you're doing.
Okay, cool. So I was just going to talk about a bunch of projects that we worked on, just 3 of them, and they are related to cultural institutions and other types of people, publishers, and one car manufacturer, but they're quite interesting in terms of the ways that we deliver content across various different delivery mechanisms. So can we see that? Okay, that's a boring slide about Cogapp. We're a digital agency in Brighton in the UK, as I just discussed. Okay, so this was an iPad app that we did for Dorling Kindersley, a publisher in the UK, and they have a great range of travel guides. And the nice thing about this project is they had a paper guide that's basically got tons and tons of useful locations in cities around the world. So this one I think is showing Paris. And what was useful about the guide in paper is that you could walk around the city and you could look up places, you can see what's going on. But what was useful about getting into a digital format, and it really starts letting you explore useful uses of that content, is that not only can we use the maps to let people say, where am I within the city, when we process all the data in the offline content into an online format, we can then say to people, okay, well, we know you're here, and so we know that these types of things are near you. So you could categorize it by saying, show me all the museums near me, and then also show me all the restaurants near me. So if you were looking at a museum, show me all the restaurants near that museum, for instance. So if you were planning a trip around the city, it was a really great way of using that content in a more useful way than a print publication would give you. This is quite an interesting project that we did for Land Rover. So Land Rover, and this is pre-smartphone days, so it's quite an interesting one. So basically Land Rover do these press days where they get people to drive their new products around, and they want people to be impressed by them, but also be told about the unique features that they have. And so we developed a system for them where these things have sat-nav already, so we developed a system that sort of intersperses with their sat-nav and allows them to run a route through, record lots of useful content like, you're driving up a hill, feel the gears kick in, you're driving down a hill, feel the brakes kick in, etc. Record that in 17 different languages, and then let people just drive the route on their own and be given basically a guided tour of the route automatically, which is very handy for them from a sales opportunity. And then lastly, I just want to show this one because it's really good fun. It was a project called Journey On in the UK. It's not coming up at the moment, but I can describe it. It's around the streets of Brighton. They were trying to promote the use of bike use instead of driving cars. And so what we did is we ran the streets of Brighton and got people to spell out the name of the project, which is Journey On, using the streets of Brighton as the letters. And then we got on the day, someone dressed up as a massive pencil had a special device in his pocket, and he would ride around that space spelling out the name of the street he was on, so that people in certain locations could plot where he was, and then there it goes, it's come up. So you can see it spells out Journey On the map, and people were watching this from all across Brighton and up at the station and stuff, and ended up with this big event. There you go, I'm going to stop there, other people talk.
All right, great. Next up, we have Marc Check. He's our associate. He's the associate vice president for information and interactive technology at the Museum of Science, Boston. Take it away, Marc.
Excellent. Thank you. You can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Wonderful. So my name is Marc Check. I'm currently the associate vice president for information and interactive technology at the Museum of Science in Boston, and I will bring up some slides here. Excellent. So I've been in the museum industry for about 16 years now. So previous to being involved with the Museum of Science, I was also director of technology for the Strong National Museum of Play and the Rochester Museum and Science Center, both in Western New York. And as you can imagine, being in museums in this day and age and working with a variety of technologies, and the prevalence of mobile that's really exploded over the past several years. Mobile on its own is a great tool for being able to understand our exhibits, our collections, our artifacts within the museum. But what we've been really interested in is how can we connect those mobile experiences and that virtual layer of content with the physical content within our buildings, and location awareness is obviously the answer to that. So we want to be able to connect the physical world and all this virtual information and experience that we have. We wanted to create a greater depth of experience than we can possibly do with classic label copy or even digital interactives on the museum floor. We want to make use of the visitor preferences that they have as well. So as they're visiting our institution, how do they want to consume our content? How do they want to learn about our core competencies and those types of things? So what we've noticed over the past several years is basically that mobile tours have become very common, but what we're really lacking is the contextual piece of that. So how do we get the user's preferences into that? Who are they? Where are they? What do they want to learn about these exhibits? So over the course of the past several years, we've been exploring all sorts of technologies and doing all sorts of prototyping and testing with them. I think most museums you go into, you'll see use of things like QR codes. Now in this day and age, I think low-energy Bluetooth and iBeacon technologies are becoming more popular. RFID's been used a lot in museums. We've done a lot of experimentation with Wi-Fi triangulation to try to pinpoint people's locations within museums. And we've even played with some sonification technologies. But the struggle that we've had as we've looked at location awareness for indoor spaces in museums is that the technology so far have been somewhat cumbersome. In the case of things like QR codes, not particularly aesthetically pleasing when we put them up around the gallery. Some are really good at short range, other ones good at long range, but not so good at the other. And then mostly what we've been looking at is how do we create a sustainable location-aware environment in museums. So by sustainable, we're not installing and having to keep up to date and refresh every few years a major infrastructure. So there's a lot of technologies, and the combinations of a lot of these technologies have worked great, but what we've been working on in particular over the last couple of years here at the Museum of Science is light-based technology. So we partnered with a company called Byte Light, who's a local startup here in the Boston area, and they actually approached us fairly early on and were interested in us working with them to help iterate their technology. And it's interesting because what we're using is light bulbs for location awareness. So on any LED light, the light's modulating faster than the human eye can see, essentially pulsing out ones and zeros. Their technology basically hacks the modulation on that bulb so that it's pulsing out a unique global binary address. And the nice part about this is because with this technology, we can make use of any mobile device that has a front and back facing camera on it. The camera actually reads those light pulses, so it's not tied to a particular technology or platform or service on any particular provider. And as long as the camera can see the lights, that's great. So what we've done over the past 2 years is we started a pilot of this program in an exhibit called Connor's Computer Place here, about a 2,500 square foot exhibit. And we're doing all of the things you would expect, like customer wayfinding, so being able to navigate around an indoor space, delivering content related to the exhibits and the artifacts within that space. But I have also started to experiment with some other uses of location awareness technology, like accessibility. How do we make the content consumable by people who might have a hearing impairment or a sight impairment? Or even as we talk about accessibility, talking about cognitive accessibility, how can we deliver content at different cognitive layers? So a third grader and a PhD in mathematics might walk into the exhibit wanting to digest content in very different ways. And then, of course, after the fact, we're experimenting with using the data that we gather from that for things like push marketing and for analytics of how people move through the space and what they're actually doing in the space. So we've been doing that for about 2 years, and now we're moving into the next steps. The picture you'll see in this slide is of our Blue Wing, which is a much, much larger space, 3 levels within this area, and we're going to be outfitting this area with these bike light enabled bulbs. And the nice timing of this is this particular company has just gone through a little bit of a shift in their technology where the modulation chips on the bulbs are not only light-based, but they're also incorporating low-energy Bluetooth. So we're actually using a combination of these 2 technologies, and we're going to start to do a much broader, wider, more complex prototyping and some formal research and evaluation around this technology. So that's where we are now, and excited to move into the future of location awareness here. And I'll hand it off to our next speaker.
All right. Thank you, Marc. And joining us from Japan, I think it's really late right now. Yeah. Is that right, Vivian?
Yes.
Like 1 in the morning.
One in the morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Take it away, Vivian.
Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about myself and the projects we've been working on. Let me get myself into the screen. So I'm Vivian Haga. I recently actually moved to Japan. I was formerly the director at Balboa Park Online Collaborative, and I was in Balboa Park for over 12 years, first at the Museum of Photographic Arts as the director of education and deputy director, and then moved over to Balboa Park Online Collaborative. And prior to that, I've worked at a variety of museums across the country, including the Dixon Gallery and Gardens in Memphis, Tennessee, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. For the last 2 years, we've been working with several institutions in Balboa Park, working with localized Wi-Fi chips. And part of that was we had built out the Wi-Fi foundation in Balboa Park. So we are fortunate in that we do have that foundation there. But for some of our institutions, the first one we worked with was the Timken Museum of Art. And they have some aesthetic concerns with their galleries. They don't have any signage at all in their galleries. So one of the issues we ran into with them is how do we get content to visitors? Visitors want to know more about the artwork. So we started partnering with a Japanese company. The Japanese company provided localized Wi-Fi chips that we can actually move anywhere in the galleries. We can put it near an artwork and connect content to it. And so with the Timken Museum of Art, we were able to provide content to visitors. And this was a prototype application. It's Android-based only at this point. And visitors were able to download an app on their own device, and they could actually walk in, find the object, and it would provide additional information for them. So that's essentially how the Timken app worked with the Play Sticker Wi-Fi. The following last summer, we decided to continue the partnership and actually work with the Japanese Friendship Garden. They also had aesthetic concerns with their content. Because of a Japanese garden aesthetic, they don't have any signage as well. What we wanted to experiment with them is actually solar play stickers. One of the challenges with the Wi-Fi chips that we were using at the Timken is that it is battery operated, and so one of the sustainability issues was actually changing out the batteries. So with the Japanese Friendship Garden, we actually experimented with solar panels, and fortunately in Southern California, sun is actually very prevalent, so we don't have to worry about that. And that worked really well. We decided to create a crowdsourced app where we invited visitors to actually help us determine the actual clues for each of the locations. They also submitted drawings, and when you actually open up the app, you can tap on a particular location, move to that location, and then you would actually receive some sound clues. And when you actually are near the location, the Wi-Fi chip will actually signal more information to pop up for the user. So that's how we've been experimenting with localized Wi-Fi chips and location-based information for a variety of institutions. We are this summer moving towards iBeacons and experimenting with those. One of the limitations with the Wi-Fi place sticker chips is that it is Android-based, and we know some of our users, of course, use iPhones. So this summer what we're doing is actually porting the Japanese Friendship Garden app into using iBeacons instead, and there's been some challenges with that. We're also trying to see if we can actually map visitor flow using a number of iBeacons put together, and there are definitely some issues with that, which we can talk more about at the panel.
All right. Well, thank you, Vivian, and Marc and Joe. I think we're all coming from different from industry in terms of Joe, Marc from a science museum, and Vivian from a art perspective. So one of the things to bring it back to the location-based services to the Horizon Report is really examining the impact of this technology for teaching and learning. So I just want to kind of go around the horn and get your take on what is the impact of location-based services for teaching and learning within the museum space. So Joe?
Well, for me, it's about the ease at which you can get information to people. So, we spend a lot of time designing user interfaces for people to get to information as soon as possible. And being able to use these location-based services means that you're just basically cutting down a whole bunch of interface that you don't need. You walk into a space, someone doesn't have to work out what gallery they're in, work out what they stood in front of, work out, which painting they're interested in finding. It could, in theory, just get that information directly to them. And equally, if you're trying to take them on a flow of different areas in which you're trying to direct their attention, or you're trying to give a collection of information to each other, then these kinds of technologies are really useful to people. On the other side, it obviously throws up quite interesting ways of, you're basically making technology invisible, so it's quite difficult to then introduce people that these things exist in the first place. These are other issues that come up. But for me, yeah, it's all about getting people into an experience in the most seamless way possible, because most of the people that we're dealing with don't like technology that much.
Okay, great. How about you, Marc? What is your take on the impact of this technology on teaching and learning?
Sure. Well, I think the impact is pretty limitless. I mean, it's a relatively new technology, as we learn how to use it more. And we do more user testing. I think we'll learn a lot of things we don't even know now. But right off the top of my head, I would say the first kind of three areas is, similar to what Joe said. I think number one, just being able to provide layered information. So, different contextual information depending on, who's visiting the exhibit and where they are within the exhibit or within the institution. And tied closely to that is also personalized learning. So I mentioned earlier that a third grader or a PhD might want to learn about the same subject matter, but obviously they're going to be approaching it from different angles just in terms of educational level and what they're coming into the experience already armed with. But even beyond that, I think when we talk about personalized learning, we're talking about learning styles. So being able to have a lot of, for instance, media available for somebody who's a visual learner or an auditory learner or a more kinetic learner, to be able to just offer a greater number of ways to approach that exhibit or that experience, I think is important to the learning process. And then I think finally at the end of that, what we're realizing as well is museums have acted very much in the authoritative mode for quite a long time. When people come here to learn, we have kind of been in the business of curating that learning experience, telling them what's important and what they should learn and should appreciate in art museums and science museums. I think this type of technology, not just location awareness, but mobile technology and layered information as a whole, puts a lot more power into the hands of the individual to kind of choose what they think is important and what they want to learn about in relation to our artifacts and our exhibits. And for us to step a little bit away from that authoritative mode and allow other users and visitors to provide some of those learning experiences for others, to crowdsource information from our visitors to be consumed by other visitors within the institution. And I think that's a pretty significant shift in terms of how learning happens within these types of institutions.
And further to that as well, I think that whole idea of layering information is particularly important, because we often think about textual information or particularly audio information surrounding works that you might deliver up to people through location-based things, but it could be so many other things, and I don't think we've really started scratching the surface of that. So yeah, for different audiences at a location, providing different types of information to them, but also capturing lots and lots and lots of different types of information from people, drawings, voice recordings, tweets, everything that could be piled onto this thing. And then you just end up with this huge amount of meta content that's surrounding these locations that you can deliver up to people should you know the kind of thing that they would want to consume. That's a good word.
Yeah, I'd like, before I move on to Vivian and get her take, I want to invite the audience to also kind of give us their take. How do you think location-based services might impact teaching and learning? We see from Myra Lambert, as well as for learning preferences, it's great for accessibility too. So yeah, please, here's a great addition. So please, add to our conversation by typing into the unified chat kind of what your take might be on this. Here we got another one from Neil Stimler. It says, location awareness valuable. Try Field Trip. Field Tripper. I am not familiar with that, but I'll check it out after this session. Hey, Vivian, so what's your take on location-based services for teaching and learning?
I definitely think that there's a lot of potential for it. Not only are you tailoring what people are seeing and experiencing by just the location they're at, but then also just socially, with the technologies that are out there in mobile technology, in particular in social media, they can start connecting with others in the area and sharing their thoughts and what they're interested in. So I think there's definitely a lot of potential for learning, for experiences, and social interaction that, with the combination of all the different technologies, that there's a wealth of information out there and experiences that people will eventually be able to share. I also think that it's important, with some of our projects, especially with the Japanese Friendship Garden, we really wanted to bring the visitor into the process, and so that's part of the reason why we crowdsourced a lot of the content, because again, by having them interact with it, they're going to be more engaged, and it also again shows the museum staff what people are interested as well, and it becomes part of the learning experience and their experience with that particular institution.
Okay, great. And looks like we have a comment from Elizabeth Merritt. Enables the museum to curate the wider environment, including things they don't own or control. We have another comment here. Yes, the potential to connect our collections to their histories and context in the wider world, not just inside the museum walls. That's an interesting thing to think about too, is the idea of the virtual and the physical visitor, and understanding that those are beginning to increasingly blur. So what we're kind of talking about is where we are now with location-based services. What kind of projects are we working on? How is, what is the impact now? Let's spend the rest of the session really talking about potentials for the future. Things about how might this change in 10, 20 years from now. Let me frame this next question on the personalization aspect of location-based services. How will this technology become more personalized? That seems like the trend, the movement, the trajectory for this type of technology. So I'll go ahead and start with Marc this time. How do you think this tech will become more personalized in the future?
I think it's kind of the obvious next step of the technology. It's one thing to be location aware, but another to be aware of location and preferences. We're seeing personalization of pretty much every other experience we're seeing in technology and media now. Whether it's your TiVo or your cable box suggesting and knowing what you want or are going to watch. We see it in Netflix. We see it when we're shopping at Amazon, or if you look at your email inbox. I think the wide world is getting a lot smarter about recognizing trends and connections about what you're looking for in a personalized experience. So, I think it's a pretty easy leap to be able to do that. As we're in museums. Some of the experiments that we've had already is talking about themed wayfinding through a museum. So our museum in particular is a very large institution. We have a lot of varied content, but thematically some of that content is spread throughout different exhibit halls and different sections of the museum. So in terms of personalization, if somebody's coming in with a particular interest, being able to suggest to them certain wayfinding paths or tours through the museum that connect similar content through disparate areas. That's been pretty interesting. We've done that thematically around subjects like mathematics or electricity. But what I think becomes a little more interesting when we talk about personalization of content is the crowdsourcing aspect and the suggestions we've had from guests about them being able to lead theme wayfinding tips to other visitors. For instance, visitors who are coming in with young visitors all the time, 3 or 4-year-olds. What are the best exhibits and the most fun things for them to do in the museum environment? And while we could suggest that, I think having that personal experience and sharing it with others is a really interesting aspect of this.
Yeah, I think that Elizabeth brought up a really good point here about how she'd like to see it. I want a universal learning preferences profile that follows me from museum to museum, tailoring content to my interests and learning styles. Wouldn't that be great? I'll turn it over to Vivian. What do you feel about the personalization of this? You've been kind of continuing to develop your place sticker. How do you see that changing maybe 10 years from now?
Definitely, as Marc was saying, that we want to be able to combine it with us pushing information to actually having understanding what the visitor has seen in the past and want to see, and tailoring it so that we can make suggestions. What I would love to see, especially in Balboa Park, is not just suggestions within that institution, but suggestions around the park of making connections with other institutions, other artworks that might be relevant for that particular user. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I also think something that came up in the chat also that we've been trying to figure out for this summer is also the back end. We want to be able to track how long are each visitor spending on each particular artwork? Where are they going? So that as museum professionals, we have a better understanding of, how the visitors are flowing, what works are popular, what works excite them and make them spend a lot of time. So even on the back end, there's definitely a lot more work, a lot more potential in the future to be able to map out what visitors like and how to deliver information to them.
Yeah, and I see an interesting conversation going on in the chat. This idea of, okay, if each Jordan said, Elizabeth, that is an excellent point. Right now, most museums make their own apps. So there's no real way to connect it with other institutions. Also, I don't know if I would want to spend another 5 to 10 minutes in each institution downloading its app, registering, and then entering preferences. And I think that comment is really kind of connected to Lori Stepp's comment of, curious how this will interact with the coming Internet of Things. Will have us relating to location differently in an interconnected way. So maybe we'll see in the future this kind of merging of different technologies so that the interconnectedness kind of helps us move past the scanning a QR code thing. That once we have our preferences set and we have an opportunity to make smarter museums, that all of a sudden a device that we might have with us will help us understand our preferences and make that a more seamless experience moving from museum to museum. I'd be curious to see what your take on that, Joe, as developing these types of products and ideas. What's your take on the personalization in the future?
I think what I like seeing at the moment is shared experiences that are big, like a group, like a family can have in the same physical space. So you have it's going back to the same topics of themed content, layered content, etc., etc. But still, you'd have to describe who you were and what you were into and why you were here, and so I think as we move forward and everyone is wearing more wearable computers, everyone is more prepared for their personal data to be shared in various ways in the cloud, etc., etc. Then it's easier to infer who someone is, and so it's easier to automatically serve up the kind of content that they may be interested in viewing. I was sort of seeing the other day people started wearing like sleep tracking bands, and then they're sharing the information out to each other about how well they're sleeping, and people are saying that, oh, you didn't sleep very well last night. Is that, so that it is that level of sharing that I think will aid this level of personalization. So I think, knowing who someone is, what mood they're in, what stuff interests them, what they saw in other museums, what education resources that they're undertaking in other areas, and then just tailoring content directly to them, so you just don't have to choose that stuff. I think that's great.
And Joe, I'll stick with you for this next question, and it's really about creating awareness for this type of technology. How do we market and promote this technology? How do we make sure people are aware that it's out there and it's available? What are some future directions that we'll see? I know right now the QR code is kind of that bridge that not all of us are big fans of, but right now it serves as a utility to get us to that, from the physical world to that online world. What do we see in terms of making people aware that they can use this technology or that it's available? What's your take on that, Joe?
It is a really tricky one, isn't it? Because you are providing a service to someone that's invisible, and in many places, like Vivian was talking about, you have such restrictions on how you can show those signals to people that there are things around, without interfering with the actual things that you're trying to present. And so it is very difficult. I think, probably a very upfront signage as you're going into this experience, telling someone that this thing exists and trying to explain it as well as you can, so when you get into it, you don't have to pepper the environment with intrusive devices to get people to get back, to realise this stuff's going on. Maybe physical props can be really useful. I saw someone the other day was using magnifying glasses that you kind of look through. That was quite an interesting thing. They handed them out, so people didn't have to set up their own phones. They just took these things around. And we've used similar things in the past, not for location-based stuff, but just for providing a layer on top of content and gallery that was less intrusive because it felt more like a physical thing that people were used to. So I think that can be a very handy and useful device. But I think ultimately, it's about good signage, non-intrusive signage, and then just intelligent use of various different types of technologies. Where am I? What direction am I facing in? What kind of thing can my phone see? Those kinds of technologies are really becoming much more widespread, and so being able to serve things correctly to people is becoming easier.
Yeah, and I think in our initial discussion about this topic, one of the interesting points that came up was, one of our topics today is on BYOD, bring your own device, and I think it was Marc that was talking about, well, maybe this is an opportunity to provide devices for individuals because that location-based service is already in part of that tool that's being offered to you. So it's less of go in and download something and more of like, here you go. This is, instead of giving you a map, it's a map that actually moves you along and can maybe connect with you socially. Was that you that talked about maybe the potential of equipment?
I probably talked about it. I would not say it necessarily was a proponent of it.
Oh.
I think that's something that museums have been struggling with over the past several years. I know a lot of museums have moved towards providing devices that have the applications and the technology preloaded on it. And I think one of the reasons we do that, besides the convenience of not having to find and download and learn an application necessarily, has also been a point that, while it's lessening, is still a big consideration in museums, and that's the idea of accessibility and exclusivity. There are still a good number of our visitors who come into the institution who do not have, are not bringing their own device that's internet enabled and has the capabilities to partake in this type of experience. And it's a big consideration for us. How if we offer this type of experience, how exclusive are we being to those who can afford or are of an age and to be able to bring this technology with them? And when we talk about ages, we're not just talking about young kids who may not have their own personally enabled smart device, but there's also still a significant digital divide out there, an older sector of our generation that is either uncomfortable or really hasn't experienced this type of technology. That said, you need your own business model for managing your fleet of own devices within an institution, and I think a lot of museums that have tried that have found that particularly challenging. So I think everybody's just waiting for the day where I think they hand out the iPhone as soon as you come out of the womb, and then it's there for you the rest of your life.
A lot of institutions do offer iPods or Android devices, especially with the Play Sticker. Many of our audiences don't use Android, they use iPhones. So in order to make sure that they can access the Play Sticker content, we actually have Android devices available. Again, it is a challenge because not everyone knows to turn on their Wi-Fi, and that Wi-Fi is available. So that's even a challenge, just having that barrier to break through. But also, again, we don't want to be exclusive. We want to make sure everybody has access. And so it is a mix where you do have a mix of bring your own device as well as providing devices for people.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting next few years as these technologies begin to mature. One of the things that is not related to the actual device itself has more to do with the physical nature of the museum or facility that we're in. With this type of technology, infrastructure is always a big important consideration, even the gallery flow. So I'll return back to Vivian with this question. What kind of infrastructure considerations does a museum need to consider? I know that you've worked in some different spaces with not only different infrastructure limitations, but for instance, some places don't have interpretive materials on the wall. So how do you work with providing interpretives and providing access to those?
Balboa Park Online Collaborative is unique in that we work with so many different institutions with different infrastructure. We've been able to help standardize some of it by actually creating a park-wide Wi-Fi network. But even with that, there are some locations where Wi-Fi is not available. And cellular is another one where the Japanese Friendship Garden, for example, cellular is really horrible in their lower garden, which is brand new. So we've had to be creative and use a lot of different devices and infrastructure. I think each space, each environment is going to be very different, and you have to look at all those considerations. So for the Timken, the localized Wi-Fi chips worked because, again, it's a simple Wi-Fi chip that sent out a small signal. It could move with the artwork. So if the artwork came down, the chip went with it. So you didn't have to worry about signage issues of, oh, here's an audio tour that's not there because the artwork got moved for one day. And then with the Japanese Friendship Garden, again, because they were completely outdoors, we went with solar. So that is definitely something to think about. We are finding some challenges with the Bluetooth in that because of the range, some areas may not be conducive to it. So that's another consideration is, the range of the content and the particular artwork you might be trying to share content with. and that will help determine what type of infrastructure and technology you might want to use as well. So there's definitely a lot of considerations for infrastructure.
All right. Before I go to Marc, I want to get Joe's take on this, since you're developing tools to work within a variety of spaces. What kind of infrastructure issues or challenges or progress within that area do you see?
So I've been particularly interested at the moment with what you can do with iBeacons and particularly how low you can go with them. So in terms of room-based stuff, that's fine. And probably if you're in an institution where you have quite big things on the wall, you could probably indicate to people what you're looking at. But some people have lots of rooms packed with tons and tons of drawers full of tons and tons of fossils, for instance, and how you indicate to people not only what room you're in, what you're stood in front of, what drawer you have open, etc., and then what you're looking at, and how you identify a particular rock, for instance. So I'm interested in how the fidelity of this stuff and how far you can get down to indicate to people what's going on, and then the actual implications of that. How many of these things do you need to be stamping around all over the place? And it's quite a lot, and it's not as good as I thought it was going to be. But technology is progressing. It will certainly, someone will crack this. And I like the idea of these combinations of things, like Marc's light bulb flickering and iBeacons and things that your phone does already. I think all these things combined are going to start making these things more likely. So yeah, it's interesting times.
Have you experienced any problems with iBeacons? Laurie from our audience is asking about iBeacons.
I think they're really definitely a way forward with finding where people are in space internally. I think what's interesting about them is that they certainly are. Interference is an issue. So if you've got a big gallery that's very busy with lots of people with lots of phones on, then certainly that's going to become something that you need to deal with. These things are based on how close you can see a signal and how strong that signal is, and that signal can be interfered with very much. So whatever experience you're trying to provide to people, you need to take those considerations into and test these things in real life situations, because they don't often plan out as you think they would.
And also the devices too, because older devices won't necessarily work with the new iBeacons as well, and so that's something to also keep in mind for your user base. If you're considering bringing your own device, you have to consider what kind of devices they're bringing in and whether or not they have the capabilities of working with the new iBeacons.
I want to turn it over to Marc. I think what you're doing at the Museum of Science Boston is really fascinating. This idea of the Byte Light, this idea of retrofitting existing infrastructure to support location-based services. Tell us more about that and where you see kind of infrastructure considerations impacting you there.
Sure. Well, and it was really the infrastructure considerations that led us to using this particular technology and a solution as the one we wanted to try. I mean, I think when institutions kind of struggle with what location awareness technology they're going to use, you're really kind of looking at it through a few different lenses. Affordability, accuracy, and then flexibility. And when I talk about flexibility, we're talking about development flexibility for applications and ease of adding content, but also flexibility in terms of what devices, as Vivian mentioned, is it going to work on, and how long are those technologies going to be available on those devices, or are they available yet on those devices? So one of the things we were looking for, and that was really attractive to us for the Li-Fi technology, is the fact that we're not implementing and making a commitment to supporting an entirely separate infrastructure. We're really making use and dual purpose of an infrastructure that we already had in place. So for us, that was really kind of the driving factor. Granted, I think iBeacons and low energy Bluetooth, it's probably one of the best technologies in terms of affordability and not having a great expense with an additional infrastructural cost. So I think that's why we're seeing a lot of popularity in that area. And personally, I'm all for it. I think that's fantastic. Ultimately, we need we need location awareness technologies that we're not going to implement once, but ones that we can sustain and iterate on over the years. And we chased Wi-Fi for a long time. And if you're in a large area that has a lot of outdoor transit, I think it works great. For us, fine-tuning a Wi-Fi infrastructure indoors is a pretty costly endeavor. Good Wi-Fi equipment costs a lot, and if you want to be able to maintain service and support agreements on that equipment, you're essentially refreshing your infrastructure every 3 to 4 years. And depending on the size of your institution, that can be extremely expensive as you move down the road. So yeah, that's really the primary reason why we went with the light base, and we're continuing to iterate on that technology. The other point I would mention associated with that is we need to take a look and follow the retail industry a little bit as well. What the retail industry ultimately decides to implement for indoor location services is where the costs are going to be driven down, where there's going to be the most support and the most services. And I think we're seeing a lot of the low-energy Bluetooth, iBeacon, the Li-Fi, light-based stuff being implemented in some of our big box retailers and some of the government industries. And I think that's a good indication when we think about infrastructural costs and considerations that there's going to be a lot more support for that in the future.
A quick question from the audience. Does ceiling height or ambient light limit byte light?
Ceiling height can to a point, but it's being used in some of the big box retailers where they have extremely high ceilings. Generally, as long as the light is visible, it's readable from the cameras on the phone. Ambient light does not generally affect it at all. At least we have not run into any situations where other ambient light has affected it.
And it's basically, to reiterate, the lights blink at a certain frequency that only your phone picks up. It's very imperceptible to the naked eye.
Yes, so every LED light basically blinks on and off. Every retail LED bulb that you buy and put in your infrastructure, it blinks on and off faster than the human eye can see. The way they act right now is they're just blinking on and off in a constant rate, 10, 10, 10. When you modify the bulb, then you can tell it to blink 111100, 111100 over and over again. You're essentially assigning to that light a unique global address. So the camera on the phone can recognize that faster than the human eye can see, blinking, and realize that it's a certain light with a certain global address, and also very accurately judge the distance to that particular light. And then the more light you have in an area, 3 or more, you begin to triangulate between those, and you get some really good accuracy. I would say the one limitation that we ran into that was fairly significant for museums when we were looking at byte light technology was the fact that if you don't have your camera exposed, even though it takes direct and reflected light off carpeting and floors, do we necessarily want our visitors to have their devices out in their hand all the time to be able to read it? And I think retailers had the same concern as they were thinking about how these devices are going to be used in their spaces. So we were very happy to see the addition of Bluetooth technology to this as well. So it kind of covers those sore spots where if the camera is not exposed, it's also looking for a Bluetooth signal, which is housed in that light bulb as well.
All right, Mark. Well, we just have a few minutes left, so I want to get some closing thoughts on location-based services. I'm gonna stick with you, Mark. What directions for the future do you see this technology having? 20 years from now, how do we see this impacting the way that we work? We navigate around museums.
Yeah, well, I would like to think that in 20 years, you're kind of even blurring the line between just being a technology or an experience specifically related to museums. I suppose if we want to go way out there, the way things are going, I would kind of think in 20 years, the idea of a constant virtual concierge that's associated with somebody, whether you're shopping or vacationing or going to a museum, that concierge is aware of what you've done before, what your preferences are, and is constantly offering you suggestions or help, whether you're in a museum or a store, trying to help to lead you to more satisfying experiences or interactions with any sort of content.
Great. How about you, Vivian? What do you see happening way in the future as we've worked out these technological kinks within power and infrastructure? How do you see this impacting a visitor in the museum?
Well, I see the technologies merging, not just location aware, but other types of technology all merging together, and having visitors and staff, even at institutions, be more comfortable with technology. Technology is, so it doesn't become a separate, oh, it's a separate museum technology experience. It's part of their everyday life. It's what they do normally in shopping and so on, and having it translate into the museum, so it doesn't become something that is a unique experience, but something that is common. And like Marc said, having your virtual guide, curator, docent, or concierge there to basically, if you want to learn about a particular artwork, having that information right there, having somebody be available anytime, anywhere, and so that you have that power to get to content when you need it.
Last but not least, Joe.
I think we're privileged in that I get to go into museums and talk to curators who know a lot about their subject matters and are very enthusiastic. And so being able to walk into any space, any museum, and just be provided with that with someone who knows me very well and knows exactly what I do and can just take me around and give me a great experience of the place would be great. Either that, or we'll just all have time machines and I'll come back and slap an audio guide around my neck on a lanyard.
All right. Well, it's a great conversation thinking about these different ways that we might use location-based services in museum from three very different perspectives. So on behalf of the NMC, I want to thank Joe, Marc, and Vivian for this lively discussion on location-based services. So thank you again, panelists, for joining us, and thank you, audience, for joining in on this great conversation. I'll see you again in about 28 minutes. Thank you.